In every war, there are secrets too monstrous to survive the daylight, documents too dangerous for governments to ever admit existed. Beneath the familiar narrative of World War II lies a darker record, files deliberately locked away, stamped with top secret and eyes only, then buried in restricted vaults for generations. These were not simply battlefield strategies or casualty reports. They were testimonies of crimes committed in the shadows, treaties forged in blood, and alliances that betrayed the very people who fought for freedom. As the world celebrated victory in 1945, intelligence agencies on both sides quietly began sifting through mountains of captured documents, choosing what history would remember and what it would forget. What emerged was a selective truth, a sanitized account of good triumphing over evil. What remained hidden were the forbidden files, records that, if exposed, would dismantle the moral certainty of that victory. Tonight we unseal those long-buried archives. We will walk through laboratories where prisoners became experiments, boardrooms where secret pacts ensured the survival of fascism, and mass graves left behind by governments sworn to protect liberty. Listen closely, because these are not rumors or legends. They are the disturbingly forbidden files of World War II. 5 suppressed histories that were never meant for the public to hear. Comment your thoughts below, because once revealed, these secrets cannot be ignored. Classified experiments beneath Dachau's shadows. The sprawling complex of Dachau, established in 1933 as the first Nazi concentration camp, became far more than a site of imprisonment and death. Hidden deep within its barracks, its medical wings, and its subterranean chambers, Dachau became a laboratory where human beings were stripped of their dignity and used as disposable instruments in the name of so-called science. At the surface, Dachau was a place of torment, hunger, and execution. But beneath, behind locked iron doors and sealed windows, experiments classified under codenames like Seewasser and Unterdruck were carried out with meticulous cruelty. These were not mere trials. They were systematic violations of the human body, recorded in detailed graphs and reports destined for the desks of Reich medical authorities, and later, Allied military researchers. Among the most infamous of these were the hypothermia experiments. Prisoners were immersed in ice water for hours, their screams muffled by the thick stone walls, while SS doctors and Luftwaffe physicians carefully observed the rate of their deaths. These experiments were justified under the pretense of saving downed pilots who had crashed into the freezing waters of the North Sea. Yet the brutality was far from scientific detachment. Victims were sometimes revived through grotesque methods, such as forced copulation with camp guards or the application of scalding water, both designed to test the limits of human endurance. Every death was recorded in detail: body temperature graphs, heart rhythms, and time of final breath, all inscribed into what the Reich called medical progress. The altitude experiments were no less horrific. Using a decompression chamber confiscated from aviation laboratories, prisoners were strapped inside and subjected to simulated high-altitude conditions. Many convulsed, foamed at the mouth, and died under pressures equivalent to 20,000 meters above sea level. Survivors were left brain-damaged, their bodies discarded once they could no longer provide useful data. The documentation, stamped with eagle crests and marked Geheim, secret, was later found by US forces, and instead of burning it as the atrocities it recorded, portions were quietly sent to American aviation research units. Files reveal cross-references with US Air Force projects conducted in the late 1940s, a chilling continuity between Nazi torture and Cold War aeromedical science. The so-called Seewasser trials pushed cruelty even further. Prisoners, many of them Romani or captured resistance fighters, were forced to drink only processed seawater. They developed seizures, organ failure, and hallucinations. Medical logs noted the onset of madness as their bodies shrank into skeletal forms. This research, horrifyingly, was later used to develop survival protocols for sailors stranded at sea. A moral abyss opened. Progress built directly upon suffering that was deliberately inflicted, not volunteered. Post-war investigations revealed that certain US Navy survival manuals contained data almost word for word from these Nazi experiments. Behind these experiments were names that history often forgets. Sigmund Rascher, a Luftwaffe physician whose ambition and cruelty became legendary, and his network of SS medical collaborators. Rascher reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, who personally approved the trials. But what remains buried in archives is the involvement of external physicians, some from German universities, others who later found comfortable lives in the West. Their identities were sometimes erased in post-war documents, their crimes wiped clean with new professional titles. Redacted pages in operation. Paperclip dossiers suggest that American and British agencies knowingly concealed these affiliations to secure their expertise for Cold War competition. Survivors of Dachau testified to the agony of these trials, but their words often fell on deaf ears. At Nuremberg, some of the most grotesque details emerged during the doctor's trial of 1946-47. Photographs of shriveled corpses, decompression chambers, and frozen test subjects were entered into evidence. Yet, disturbingly, not all records were released to the public. Several American prosecutors later admitted that data judged valuable was withheld, filed away in military archives under restricted classification. Even as justice was being served, silence was already being imposed. The moral stain deepened when, in 1947, reports surfaced that fragments of Dachau data had been used in U.S. Air Force high-altitude studies conducted at Wright-Patterson Airfield in Ohio. Declassified memos from the Air Technical Intelligence Center reference valuable aeromedical insights derived from German wartime research. Though names were omitted, the trails of language and experimental parameters are unmistakable. Allied governments had condemned the atrocities but quietly harvested their fruits. For decades, families of victims fought to preserve the memory of those sacrificed. In many cases, official responses minimized or dismissed their claims, often citing lack of evidence due to destroyed records, yet hidden in dusty file boxes stamped "not to be released to public." Copies of these reports continued to circulate in closed military channels. Researchers who stumbled upon them were warned off, their careers jeopardized by the implication that Western powers had become custodians of Nazi data. Dachau's shadows reached into the Cold War, into laboratories where American pilots tested new flight suits, into medical schools where unpublished tables of human endurance under extreme stress were quietly cited. The bodies of prisoners drowned in ice water or suffocated at simulated altitudes became the unspoken foundation of survival training manuals used by NATO forces. Every chart bore silent witness to the fact that lives were destroyed, not for the sake of knowledge, but for the ruthless ambition of empires preparing for their next wars. The Dachau files remind us that the line between perpetrator and beneficiary was blurred in the aftermath of World War II. What was condemned in courtrooms was quietly repurposed in laboratories. Behind every sanitized report stood the agony of a prisoner, stripped naked, trembling, and awaiting another round of experiments that would end in silence. The shadows of Dachau were never fully erased. They were merely transferred, rebranded, and hidden beneath the comforting narrative of progress. The truth was deemed too disturbing for public knowledge, too dangerous to be admitted openly. Yet, the files remain, waiting for those who dare to confront what was deliberately buried. Forbidden Treaty of the Black Reich. As the Allies pressed into Germany in the final months of 1944, the world believed that the Nazi regime was collapsing. Berlin was reduced to rubble under constant bombardment, its armies shattered on the eastern and western fronts, and its leadership fracturing under paranoia and betrayal. But in the shadows, far from the ruined Reich Chancellery, another battle was being fought, not with tanks and artillery, but with pens, coded cables, and secret negotiations. Declassified fragments from Soviet and British archives reveal the existence of a disturbing clandestine agreement, whispered under the codename Schwarzer Reichspakt, or the Black Reich Treaty. This was not a treaty of surrender, it was an escape plan, a blueprint for survival, signed not in public chambers, but in smoke-filled boardrooms with neutral corporate representatives, Swiss bankers, and high-ranking SS officers who had already abandoned Hitler's collapsing vision. The Black Reich Treaty centered on the transfer of wealth, technology, and human capital. Beginning in late 1944, gold reserves stripped from occupied nations, priceless art stolen from private collections, and entire dossiers of advanced weapons schematics were quietly moved across borders. Neutral nations like Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina became conduits. Cargo manifests, later unearthed in intelligence reports, describe sealed crates marked with Luftwaffe insignias leaving Austrian depots under the cover of night. Some contained currency, others contained uranium ore, a resource so valuable that American intelligence scrambled to intercept it, yet many shipments vanished without a trace. their destinations obscured through layers of forged documents and diplomatic immunity. By the time Berlin fell, the Reich's physical empire was gone, but its financial and technological power had already been secured abroad. Soviet intelligence operatives monitoring the Alpine regions intercepted fragments of these transactions. Their reports, filed under NKVD case references, noted suspicious movements of SS officers through the Italian border into Switzerland. One chilling dispatch referred to negotiations with representatives of neutral industries, a phrase that later corresponded to corporations with direct post-war contracts in Europe and South America. These were not rogue operations by desperate individuals. They were sanctioned by elements of the SS hierarchy itself, determined to ensure that Nazism would not die but transform, survive, and eventually resurface in new forms. The Americans and British were not blind to this activity. Signals intelligence at Bletchley Park intercepted coded transmissions referencing Project Action Feuerland, a reference to South America, where sympathetic regimes offered safe haven. But instead of exposing the networks, some Allied leaders turned a calculated blind eye. In 1945, as Operation Paperclip began, certain Nazi scientists and financial officers who should have faced prosecution were quietly redirected to American custody. Their dossiers were marked "Do not extradite," often with a handwritten note emphasizing potential intelligence value. This deliberate silence allowed the Reich's escape networks, later known as Odessa, to establish routes across continents. Evidence suggests that banks in Zurich and Geneva played pivotal roles. Large deposits of Reichsmarks and looted currency were laundered through secret accounts, some still disputed in courts today. Argentine archival materials declassified in the 1990s describe meetings between Perón's government officials and German industrialists in Buenos Aires as early as 1944. Ships departing from Spain carried passengers under false names, often listed as engineers or consultants. These men were not simple technicians. They were high-ranking SS officers, security experts, and financial managers entrusted with rebuilding influence in exile. The Black Reich Treaty ensured that fascism's infrastructure could continue under a different flag. Perhaps the most disturbing element lies in the complicity of Western corporations. While their official records were sanitized, fragments uncovered in post-war investigations link several European and American firms to wartime deals with the Reich. These ties, if revealed, would have undermined the moral authority of Allied victory. Thus, the Black Reich Treaty remained hidden, not because it lacked evidence, but because exposing it would implicate powerful figures on both sides of the war. Soviet archives accused Western intelligence of actively suppressing documentation, and though dismissed as propaganda at the time, later declassified records reveal those accusations were disturbingly accurate. One of the most mysterious aspects of the treaty involves uranium shipments. In 1944, German forces controlled access to mines in Czechoslovakia and Norway. Intelligence suggests that portions of this uranium were diverted through secret routes, shipped to South America, where pro-Nazi networks were prepared to safeguard it. American military records show an unusual urgency to secure uranium deposits in the immediate aftermath of Germany's collapse, hinting at fear that some had already slipped beyond reach. If the Black Reich Treaty facilitated such transfers, it raises the terrifying possibility that elements of Nazi Germany were attempting to secure leverage in the coming atomic age. The post-war years saw the quiet flowering of these networks. Former SS officers resurfaced in Buenos Aires, Santiago, and São Paulo under new identities. Entire industries, aviation, pharmaceuticals, and armaments sprang up in South America, often staffed by suspiciously well-trained German émigrés. In Switzerland, dormant accounts continued to finance these operations. While Allied governments spoke of justice and reconstruction, the hidden Reich thrived, its coffers secured by the Black Reich Treaty. Some historians argue that without this shadow agreement, the survival of Nazi ideology in exile would have been impossible. Official denials lasted decades. The existence of such a treaty was labeled conspiracy, its details dismissed as exaggeration. But in the 1990s, declassified Soviet cables and fragmented Allied memoranda began to surface. They referenced unexplained transfers of assets and diplomatic protection for former SS members. The pattern became undeniable. Far from being a relic of paranoia, the Black Reich Treaty emerged as a plausible reality, a pact that ensured the Reich's ideology did not vanish in 1945 but metastasized across the globe. The betrayal runs deeper when we consider the moral implications. Ordinary soldiers fought and died believing they were dismantling a monstrous empire. Yet behind closed doors, their leaders were already negotiating with fragments of that empire, ensuring its survival in exchange for financial and technological gain. Victory then was not as absolute as it seemed. The Reich's symbols may have been destroyed, but its influence was preserved through contracts, accounts, and clandestine agreements signed under the shadow of defeat. Today, fragments of those files remain under lock and key, redacted and restricted even from researchers. The Black Reich Treaty serves as a haunting reminder. Wars may end with declarations and treaties on paper, but true power often shifts in silence. The Reich did not vanish in the flames of Berlin. It reorganized in boardrooms, bank vaults, and exiled governments thousands of miles away. This was the Forbidden Treaty, the Survival Pact, the unspoken bargain that ensured Nazism would outlive its battlefield defeat. And it remains one of the most disturbing secrets buried beneath the official story of World War II. Erased files of Unit 731 Atrocities in the frozen plains of Manchuria, far from the Western front lines and the bombed-out ruins of Europe, a hidden empire of horror was built under the direction of the Imperial Japanese Army. Its name was Unit 731, and its existence was so carefully erased that even in Japan, decades after the war, many citizens had never heard of it. Yet in the archives of American intelligence, Soviet war crimes commissions, and fragments of testimony from surviving prisoners, the atrocities committed there rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, the medical crimes of the Nazi regime. What makes Unit 731 so disturbing is not only the grotesque experimentation on human beings, but the fact that its leaders escaped justice, protected by American generals who saw their data as a priceless commodity in the coming Cold War. Unit 731 was established in 1935 under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless physician who convinced Emperor Hirohito that biological warfare would give Japan an unstoppable advantage. Based in Pingfang, near Harbin in occupied Manchuria, the compound sprawled across 6 square kilometers. Guard towers, barbed wire fences, and laboratories disguised as water purification facilities hid the truth. This was a factory of death where thousands of Chinese civilians, Korean captives, Mongolian partisans, and Allied prisoners of war were subjected to experiments too cruel to imagine. Within its walls, doctors conducted vivisections on living prisoners without anesthesia, dissecting organs to observe the effects of disease in real time. Limbs were amputated and reattached in unnatural configurations to study circulatory failure. Women were impregnated by force to study syphilis and gonorrhea transmission to unborn children. Frostbite experiments left men's arms frozen solid, then struck with sticks until skin shattered like glass. Perhaps the most infamous atrocities involved the deliberate release of plague, cholera, and anthrax. Prisoners were exposed to these pathogens through contaminated food or direct injection. Some were tied to wooden stakes in open fields while plague bombs, ceramic canisters filled with fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, were detonated overhead. Entire villages across Manchuria were infected as field tests, their populations wiped out to provide combat data. Declassified Soviet testimonies from the Khabarovsk trials of 1949 described Japanese planes dropping pathogen-laced materials over rural towns, causing epidemics that killed thousands. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, however, these proceedings were dismissed by the West as Soviet propaganda. The truth was buried not because it was false, but because acknowledging it would expose an uncomfortable fact. The United States had already struck a secret bargain with Unit 731's leaders. That bargain was codenamed Harvest. In 1947, US occupation authorities in Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, received reports of Unit 731's existence from Chinese and Soviet sources. Rather than prosecuting Ishii and his subordinates, American intelligence negotiated immunity in exchange for their research. Declassified US Army memoranda explicitly note that the data was superior to that obtained by the Germans and could not be duplicated due to experimental restrictions in the United States. The crimes were whitewashed into scientific assets. Unit 731's biological warfare findings were integrated into the US Army's chemical core and later influenced CIA programs such as MK Naomi, the biological counterpart to MK Ultra. The erased files were not lost, They were hidden, deliberately sealed away to ensure that the atrocities could never compromise the usefulness of the data. This erasure extended to the victims. Japanese officials destroyed most of Unit 731's records as the Soviets advanced into Manchuria in August 1945. Prisoners were executed en masse. Their bodies burned in crematoriums, leaving few survivors to testify. Local populations that suffered plague outbreaks were never compensated or even acknowledged. In post-war Japan, discussion of Unit 731 was taboo, with textbooks omitting any mention of biological warfare programs. Those who spoke out were silenced. Doctors and nurses who had served at Pingfang returned to civilian life, some becoming professors at respected universities, their pasts scrubbed clean by the protective hand of American intelligence. What remains today are fragments, testimonies of a few survivors, heavily redacted CIA documents, and Soviet trial records long ignored in the West. These erased files reveal that Unit 731's reach extended far beyond Pingfang. Subdivisions such as Unit 100 and Unit 1644 operated across China, experimenting on livestock, developing crop-destroying pathogens, and coordinating epidemic warfare. Together, they represented a biological warfare machine designed to devastate entire nations. Had Japan not surrendered in 1945, plans were in place to unleash these weapons on the US mainland through submarine-launched aircraft, targeting cities like San Diego and Los Angeles with plague bombs. The silence surrounding Unit 731 is as horrifying as the crimes themselves. In 1981, American journalist John Powell attempted to publish findings on the US cover-up, only to face lawsuits and government pressure. Japanese citizens who demanded official acknowledgement met resistance from their own government, which continued to deny full responsibility. Even today, victims' families struggle for recognition, their lawsuits dismissed under claims of insufficient evidence. The files that could confirm their suffering remain locked away in Pentagon archives, stamped with "not for release." What emerges from the fragments is a chilling reality. Unit 731 did not vanish into obscurity because it was forgotten. It was erased because it was useful. Its data seeped into Cold War research, into biological defense programs, and into classified projects that still echo in the shadows of modern warfare. The victims became nameless test subjects, their deaths converted into graphs, charts, and scientific papers stored in vaults. And the men who orchestrated these atrocities lived out their lives in comfort, shielded from justice by the very nation that once condemned crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. Unit 731 stands as one of the darkest stains of the Second World War, not only for what was done in its laboratories, but for how those crimes were hidden, manipulated and weaponized by global powers. The erased files remind us that history is not always written by the victors. It is often rewritten by those who see opportunity in atrocity. And until every document is unsealed, until every testimony is honored, the ghosts of Manchuria will continue to haunt the silence forced upon them. Hidden mass graves of Operation Keelhaul. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Europe celebrated liberation. Cities erupted in joy. Church bells rang across the continent, and headlines declared the fall of fascism. Yet in the shadows of this victory, one of the most disturbing and suppressed operations of the post-war era was unfolding. It was called Operation Keelhaul, a name that masked its brutality with bureaucratic precision. Beneath that name lay the forced repatriation of millions of Soviet citizens, men, women, and children who had fled Stalin's terror or been captured by German forces. Instead of being freed, they were betrayed by the Allies, herded at gunpoint into trains and trucks, and delivered into the hands of the NKVD. For most, it was a death sentence. The origins of Operation Keelhaul trace back to secret agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin sat together in Crimea, shaping the map of post-war Europe. Among the provisions, hidden in diplomatic language, was the decision that all Soviet citizens found in Allied zones would be returned to the Soviet Union, regardless of their will. Many of these people were not collaborators, but refugees, Cossacks who had fled during the Russian Civil War, peasants who had resisted collectivization, prisoners of war who had survived German camps, and families torn from their homes during Nazi deportations. To Stalin, they were traitors. To the Allies, they were bargaining chips to secure cooperation with the Soviet Union in defeating Japan. The result was a mass betrayal cloaked as diplomacy. Declassified British memoranda reveal the chilling details. In May 1945, entire encampments of Cossacks and their families in Austria were surrounded by British troops. Promised safe passage, they were instead driven to rail stations and handed over to Soviet officers. Witnesses describe scenes of panic. Women throwing themselves into rivers rather than board the trains. Fathers begging British soldiers to protect their children. Soldiers using rifle butts to force compliance. American forces in Bavaria carried out similar operations, often under orders stamped secret and labelled voluntary repatriation. But there was nothing voluntary about it. Allied guards used bayonets and gunfire to quell desperate attempts at escape. Testimonies from survivors paint a harrowing picture. One account describes mass suicides along the Drava River in Austria, where families bound themselves together and leapt into the water rather than face Soviet captivity. Others recall Soviet NKVD officers waiting at the borders with trucks, separating men from women and children, then driving the men directly to execution sites. Those spared immediate death were sent to gulags in Siberia, where starvation, disease, and forced labor claimed their lives within months. Estimates suggest that more than 2 million people were repatriated under Operation Keelhaul. The true death toll may never be known, but the mass graves discovered decades later in Yugoslavia, Austria, and Ukraine tell a silent story of betrayal. Churchill himself acknowledged the horror in private correspondence. A letter from July 1945 notes his unease at the barbarous treatment of surrendered persons. Yet politically, the operation continued, driven by the desperate need to maintain Allied unity in the fragile first months of peace. American generals, too, expressed doubts, but followed through with orders. The logic was simple but cold. Appeasing Stalin outweighed the fate of those deemed Soviet citizens. Even if they had not lived in the Soviet Union for decades, bureaucratic categories became death sentences. The cover-up was swift and effective. Official documents described the transfers as voluntary, a word repeated in reports to mask the violence. Soldiers who protested or attempted to shield the refugees were silenced. In Britain, Parliament was never fully informed of the scope of the operation. In the United States, the public remained unaware that their own military had participated in forced deportations. Soviet archives, meanwhile, concealed the executions under the classification of state crimes. For decades, the mass graves lay hidden, their existence whispered only among survivors and their descendants. The first cracks in the silence emerged during the Cold War, when émigré communities in the West began publishing testimonies. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers uncovered partial documents in British archives revealing the scale of the betrayal. Yet even then, much remained classified. Only in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did larger pieces of evidence surface. Former NKVD officers confirmed the massacres. Excavations in Eastern Europe uncovered burial pits filled with the remains of those forcibly returned. The phrase Operation Keelhaul entered historical discourse, not as a military triumph, but as one of the darkest stains on Allied conduct. The tragedy of Operation Keelhaul lies not only in the mass deaths, but in the deliberate erasure. Schoolbooks rarely mention it. Museums dedicated to World War II gloss over it. Governments continue to withhold certain files, citing national security, even decades after the fact. Survivors' pleas for recognition have often been dismissed, leaving entire generations without closure. For the families who lost loved ones, the betrayal was compounded by silence, as though their suffering was an inconvenient footnote in the triumph of victory. Yet the mass graves remain. In forests along the Drava, in fields outside Lienz, in the icy soil of Siberia, bones testify to the reality of the operation. They tell of fathers who trusted Allied promises, of mothers who chose death over forced return, of children who vanished into the Gulag system. Operation Keelhaul was not an accident of war, but a calculated policy carried out by governments that chose geopolitics over humanity. Its secrecy reveals how easily even democracies can bury the truth when it threatens the image of moral authority. To confront these hidden graves is to confront the uneasy truth of victory, that liberation and betrayal occurred side by side, that the cost of appeasing an ally was paid in human lives, and that the very nations that claimed to fight for freedom became agents of oppression. Operation Keelhaul's files may have been buried, but the earth itself has preserved their testimony, and with every mass grave uncovered, the silence grows thinner, and the betrayal becomes harder to deny. Disturbing Secrets of Operation Paperclip. When the guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, the world believed it had witnessed the triumph of democracy over fascism. Nazi banners were torn down, swastikas shattered, and the surviving leaders of the Third Reich put on trial. But even as the Nuremberg prosecutors spoke of justice, another operation was unfolding in secrecy, an operation that would bring hundreds of former Nazis into the heart of the United States government. It was called Operation Paperclip, a project cloaked in euphemism, but driven by ruthless pragmatism. Its disturbing secrets reveal that the Allied victory was not the end of Nazism's reach, but rather the quiet absorption of its knowledge, and in some cases its ideology, into the very institutions sworn to oppose it. At its surface, Paperclip is remembered for men like Wernher von Braun, the rocket scientist whose V-2 missiles had devastated London, and who later became a celebrated architect of NASA's Saturn V rocket. But the files, declassified decades later, reveal a far darker roster. Many recruits were not simply engineers, they were SS officers, Gestapo collaborators, and doctors complicit in atrocities. Their dossiers often contained damning evidence. Photographs linking them to slave labor at Mittelbau-Dora, testimonies from survivors of medical experiments, or affiliations with concentration camps. Yet these pages were quietly rewritten. CIA and Army counterintelligence officers sanitized documents, removed incriminating references, and even altered birth dates to obscure identities. Men marked as war criminals suddenly became specialists, their pasts erased with the stroke of a pen. The justification was national security. With the Cold War looming, the United States feared Soviet dominance in rocketry, chemical weapons, and psychological warfare. Operation Overcast, the program's initial name, was expanded and renamed Paperclip after the paperclips used to attach rewritten biographies over original files. It was not only about rockets, it encompassed aviation medicine, chemical warfare, and mind control research. Scientists once loyal to Hitler were soon working in American laboratories, universities, and military bases. Many were given suburban homes, new passports, and generous salaries, while survivors of their crimes struggled in silence. The disturbing scope of Paperclip can be seen in the case of Hubertus Strughold. Hailed as the father of space medicine, Strughold's American career was illustrious. He directed research at the School of Aviation Medicine and contributed to US Air Force projects. Yet buried in wartime records are reports linking his staff to the Dachau hypothermia and pressure chamber experiments, trials that killed countless prisoners. Another figure, Kurt Blome, had overseen Nazi biological warfare programs, testing plague and cancer-causing agents on prisoners. Though tried at Nuremberg, he was acquitted, in part due to American interest in his expertise. Soon after, he was quietly employed under Paperclip, feeding knowledge directly into US biological warfare research. The moral compromises extended even further. Declassified CIA documents show that Paperclip scientists provided early input for projects like MK-Ultra, where human experimentation again blurred ethical boundaries. Techniques in psychological manipulation, chemical interrogation, and sensory deprivation owed their origins to the same men who had once experimented on camp prisoners. The disturbing continuity reveals that the atrocities of the Reich did not end in 1945. They were transplanted, reframed as necessary tools in the battle against communism. Not all Americans were comfortable with the program. The State Department initially opposed bringing Nazis onto US soil, citing immigration laws and moral hypocrisy. But powerful figures in the Pentagon and intelligence agencies overruled objections, arguing that if America did not secure these men, the Soviets would. President Truman officially banned the recruitment of active supporters of Nazism. Yet the ban was circumvented with falsified documents. Truman's signature became a shield for deception, allowing Paperclip to expand under a cloak of legality. The American public was kept entirely in the dark. Newspaper headlines praised advances in rocketry and aviation medicine, never mentioning that the men behind them had overseen slave labor or human testing only a few years before. The disturbing irony is that while Holocaust survivors struggled to rebuild shattered lives, their tormentors found refuge in the United States. Families who had lost loved ones to V-2 rocket bombardments would later cheer televised broadcasts of Apollo launches, unaware that the architect of both weapons and rockets was the same man. The victim's blood was erased from the narrative, replaced by national pride and Cold War competition. Justice was not merely denied, it was rewritten. Evidence of Paperclip's true scale remained hidden for decades. Only in the 1970s did investigative journalists and congressional hearings begin to uncover fragments. The General Accounting Office admitted in 1985 that more than 1,600 former Nazis had been brought to the United States under Paperclip and related programs. Some had direct ties to war crimes, yet their files remained sealed or heavily redacted. Survivors who sought accountability found themselves facing silence or outright denial. To this day, certain Paperclip documents remain classified, protected under claims of national security. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is deeply unsettling. On one hand, it propelled the United States to dominance in space exploration, missile technology, and biomedical research. On the other, it entangled the nation in the moral corruption of harboring and rewarding men who should have stood trial. The disturbing truth is that progress was purchased with complicity, and the values of justice and accountability were sacrificed at the altar of Cold War rivalry. Every successful rocket launch, every breakthrough in aviation medicine carried a hidden shadow. The knowledge that behind it stood men who had once pledged loyalty to Adolf Hitler and committed crimes in his name. Today, when the names of von Braun or Strughold appear in history books, they are often celebrated for their contributions to science. Rarely do those same texts mention the bodies buried beneath their achievements, the slave laborers who perished at Mittelbau-Dora, or the prisoners who froze in ice tanks at Dachau. This silence is not accidental. It is the final, enduring cover-up of Operation Paperclip. Its disturbing secrets remain a warning that in the pursuit of power, even the victors of World War II compromised their morality, trading justice for knowledge and truth for expedience. The files may be stamped declassified, but the full weight of what was done under Paperclip has yet to be fully confronted. In the shadows of every war, there are truths that governments dare not speak, truths that remain sealed in dusty file boxes and buried beneath layers of redaction. Tonight, we have opened 5 of those files, each revealing a fragment of the darkness that was deliberately hidden from public view. We have walked through the cold chambers of Dachau, where science and cruelty became indistinguishable. We have traced the outlines of the Black Reich Treaty, where fascism ensured its survival through secret pacts with banks and corporations. We have unsealed the erased files of Unit 731, where human beings became test animals in the name of progress, their deaths transformed into data. We have unearthed the hidden graves of Operation Keelhaul, where liberation became betrayal, and where promises of freedom ended in execution pits. And we have exposed the disturbing secrets of Operation Paperclip, where justice was sacrificed for Cold War advantage, and war criminals were rewarded with new lives and laboratories. But even now, as we speak, questions remain. How many more files lie sealed in archives, their contents too dangerous for release? How much of our modern world was built on knowledge extracted through atrocity? And how many officials still prefer silence over truth? These are the forbidden shadows of World War II, shadows that still stretch into our present. Share your thoughts, your questions, your doubts, because history's darkest secrets survive only if we choose to look away.